Welcome to Chandwell. My name's Michael and I'm making a curved hotel for the front of my layout. I'm basing the hotel on the crescent in Ilkley. It has a chunky columned porch and interesting stone elements around the windows. In Engage, this part of the build is going to be fiddly. I print the glazed elements of the windows as grey shapes onto sticky label. I leave a border of 0.7mm within the apertures I've already cut, and I use a line 0.2mm wide to represent the frames. Because the hotel is curved, I didn't want to use really rigid glazing, so I chose the thinnest piece of acetate I had. This was from a box of party poppers from last Christmas, I think. I cut the windows out roughly and stick them to the acetate. I then crisscross the whole thing with my scalpel, cutting through the label but not the acetate. First one way, then the next. I take care on the curved bits to follow the lines as best I can. Once this is done, I peel out the resulting loose bits to reveal the glazing below. The windows are then glued to the hotel's front with PVA. I mount 1mm card behind the windows. This gives the impression of the inner wall, and it allows me to glue curtains or blinds behind the windows. The depth looks subtly 3D, and the shadows of the frames make the blinds realistic instead of flat against the glass. I finished the effect with a scrap bit of paper covered in black pen. These look about right. I used PVA to attach the front to the hotel. Elastic bands helped me keep the front in place against its curve whilst the glue set. The interior from last week's video can still be seen, thankfully. I finished off the front with the buttresses. A simple strip of texture paper is scored and cut, along with a couple of rectangles of 1/2mm card. I take care to note which is the right way up. The textures are subtly shaded, and they can look awful if stuck on upside down. I wrap one edge of the texture right round the card to make sure that the edge is textured, and I smooth it down to a crisp edge with my crochet hook. I leave the other flap alone and stick the buttress directly to the building. The remaining flap is then wrapped around the edge using PVA glue. I use the base of my crochet hook to get it stuck right into the edges, and then the steel rule to make sure the edge is nice and crisp. It's starting to look like one cohesive building now. So what about this porch? I started with the rectangular columns and the door surround against the building's wall. I cut these from 1/2mm card along with a guide to help me place them properly on the wall. They are exactly 3mm wide, and you'll see why later. I printed some stone texture to use as wraps, and I included lines to represent the arch keystone. These were cut out and then tightly wrapped around the card. These little elements were roughly cut out, and then I stuck them to another sheet of paper, and then another, so they are now 3 sheets thick. I used a pen to colour the edge of the paper a stone colour after cutting the top and bottom, and then I stuck these in little sections to the top and bottom of the columns. They are tiny, but I managed to use tweezers and my scalpel to fold them tightly around the columns. And I think this has turned out quite nicely. Maybe 2 sheets thick would have been better than 3, but I'm not going to redo them. I used PVA in my placement guide to get the first column in exactly the right place. I used the same technique for the arch. Many little slits on the curved section allow me to wrap the texture nicely around the curve. This is stuck on with PVA. I print 6 shapes onto sticky label, each one slightly different to the others. And I stick some of these to 1mm card and some to 1/2mm. I cut them out using the scalpel. The curved bit is cut freehand in many light strokes. This is almost perfect, but that gap will be covered later. One of the shapes has little rectangular notches cut out of it, and it will go together something like this. Wow, that worked really well. Each one is covered in a bit of stone texture, but I used stone coloured paint to colour the notched one by hand. I then just glue all the bits into a stack that ends up looking like the porch roof. Wow, I am happy with this. So it's time for the chunky columns. I didn't measure them when I was in Ilkley, so I made this part up. I cut rectangles and squares to represent the base and the tops of the columns. The bases are made from 2 layers of 1mm card. For the columns themselves, I found this pack of bamboo skewers in the kitchen drawer. They are exactly 3mm across, which is why those rectangular columns earlier are also 3mm wide. Placing one against the porch on top of the bits just cut, I can tell where to cut the skewer to make the column. I use an old saw to get through the tough wood. A quick file straightens the cut edge. I cut a thin strip of basic copier paper and ran a bead of glue along it. I tightly wound this around the bottom of each column a couple of times. This looks a bit like the slightly wider base of the column. 2 columns to the rectangular base. After painting in stone colour, I did a test fit. This one is a fraction too tall, but it's easy to rub it along a nail file to reduce the height a little. The ornate window detail was quite intricate. I printed the parts onto photo paper and then in turn carefully stuck these delicate items to the building. This bit is tiny. The uprights are only about 1mm wide and it's cut from 2 layers of paper stuck together. Next, 2mm wide columns cut from 1/2 mil card. And then a couple of supporting elements just over 1mm wide by 2mm tall. I had to transport them to the model on the tip of a pin. The result is something a bit like the hotel in Ilkley. I repeated for the other window and I think the result is really pleasing. I painted the card edges around the windows with stone paint and they look like they are deeply inset into the stone fabric of the building. I had a cheap week this week. I used no additional blades or glue, but I did use a sheet of A4 copier paper, an A4 sticky label, a sheet of 1/2mm card, a sheet of photo paper, a bit of paint and half a bamboo skewer. This brings the total cost of Station Road so far to £2.62. I'll be glazing and detailing the rest of the building's front next, so please join me for that. In the meantime, here's a look at last week's video about the entrance hall, just in case you missed it. But for now, thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.